All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Encouraging Truth series, where we hope to bring you every Monday morning a new encouraging truth to hopefully help you jumpstart your week. That's kind of the whole goal for this particular series that we're doing. If you don't know anything about us, we're glad you're joining us. You can go online to womensbiblestudy.com. There you can learn everything you need to know about us. We have tons of videos. We have lots of guest speakers. So we have lots of content on there. But this is something we started because of the coronavirus, actually. We were at home. We started having to videotape all of our normal Bible studies at home. And we decided to add this in hopes that every Monday morning you can get something encouraging to start your week. So that's kind of our hope for this series. Today, the truth is kind of very, very timely for all of us because we've all been, of course, dealing with this virus. And for so long, it just feels like it's never going to end. But this week, we got some kind of encouraging news, and we kind of feel like there's maybe some light at the end of the tunnel. But for the first couple months ago, or about probably a month and a half ago, we got, of course, a stay-at-home order to where we should, stay in for at least 15 days. And people were fine with that at first because 15 days is kind of like a 2-week vacation. So everyone was like, yay, that sounds like super fun. But once we started realizing it wasn't a vacation, this is kind of a few things on how we were feeling right here. Here's one of them. Yep, that's kind of how a lot of us were feeling. Here's another one. This is kind of how we were feeling too. And then by this one, we're just kind of all sick of it. So that's kind of what our life is kind of light. So for those 15 days we started, here's our word that we're working through today is this whole idea of waiting. This is our word. And so we were waiting for this 15-day period to be up. But because this virus started spreading so rapidly and more people were dying, then that 15 days turned into 30 more days. And it's not even just like waiting to go on vacation and you're all excited. This is like waiting amidst a bunch of really bad news and lots of death and a lot of negativity, and people are hurting and people are losing their jobs and people are getting sick. And the news it's not even just like waiting, but it's waiting badly, I guess is how we want to put that. So we decided to do this series, and today what we want to do is we want to give you an encouraging truth about waiting. And here it is, encouraging truth number 6. We can wait well. Now, we know this because the coronavirus will eventually be gone. I always laugh. I always say people who watch these videos in like 2 years are going to be like, what's the coronavirus? But it's not even so much just the waiting for us to be able to go back to normal life, but honestly, life is just filled with waiting. We're all waiting for something. Some of us are waiting to get a job, some to get married, some for, to have a baby. Some people are just waiting to get along with their spouse. Some people are waiting to feel better. But I started thinking about this last week, and I thought, why is it that we can wait well? And why is it different for a Christian, a follower of Jesus, to wait any differently than a non-Christian waits? And that's kind of what I was thinking about this week. Because the coronavirus is really just like any other tragic thing that happens in life. And all through life, you and I are going to go through tragic things. People will get in car accidents, or some people have lost children or spouses, or you lose your job, or you get a divorce, or whatever. So life is just filled with heartache, and it's filled with heartache whether we are followers of Jesus or whether we're not. And so the same is true for this whole idea of waiting. It's no different. Like, we all have to wait whether we're Christians or not Christians. And so my question that I was thinking this week was, is there an advantage to be a Christian? I know that sounds really weird, but is there? And is there an advantage to how we wait as a Christian versus someone who isn't a Christian? Because during this whole virus, I've kind of struggled with that, because we see a lot of our non-Christian friends, a lot of non-Christians who own their own businesses, and man, they're stressed and they're struggling, and their business has been down, and they're worried about how they're going to pay their employees, and they have to let people go, and they can't pay their bills, and they just were basket cases. But the sad thing is that we saw Christians acting the exact same way. And I know it's a very stressful time, but should Christians be waiting different than non-Christians, I guess is my point. And so I was thinking about, what does that look like? What does that look like if we as followers of Christ are supposed to wait differently, look differently, be a light to those who are panic-stricken and stressed? And so I'm hoping that we can be encouraged today with a message, with an answer, and actually to where we can learn this answer from a man named David. Most of us, if you know your Bible, you know him as King David. And David spent most of his life in this stage, that waiting stage. And since David was called a man after God's own heart, we know that he was a follower of God, a true follower of God, loved God. So let's learn some lessons from David today. Now, when we first meet David, he's out in the field. He's probably a teenager. Well, maybe not even a teenager. Maybe he's 10, 12, 13, somewhere around that area. He's out shepherding his family's sheep. And he probably had no thought that he was ever going to do anything besides that. David was the youngest of 8 children, and he's out tending to sheep while, he doesn't know this, but the prophet Samuel had been told by God to go to David's house because one of these 8 sons would be the next king. So the prophet Samuel shows up at David's house, but David's out in the field. So they parade 7 of David's brothers in front of the prophet Samuel. And Samuel says this in 1 Samuel 16:11. He says, "Then Samuel asked, 'Are these all the sons you have?' 'Well, no, they're still the youngest,' Jesse replied, 'but he's out in the field watching the sheep and goats.' And Samuel's like, 'Send for him at once. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives.' 1 Samuel 16 verse 12 says this, 'So Jesse sent for him. He,' meaning David, 'was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David in that day. Then Samuel returned to Ramah." Now, if you really think about this, this is a really weird scene because here he's with 7 of his older brothers. He's the baby of the family. And now he has just been anointed the next king. But he's a kid. And it's like, what's he going to do? Is he going to go knock on the palace door and be like, "Hey, King Saul, guess what? I'm the next king." And Saul would be like, "Are you joking? You're like 12. But I think the reason why God handpicked David is because he knew what David was like. And he knew that David wouldn't be the kind of person that would go run out and get business cards with his new title, King David, on there. He didn't take out a loan for a new chariot. He didn't call or text his friends. He didn't Snapchat or Facebook or even gloat over his brothers. You know what he did? He went back to his sheep. And he did this. He waited. And he didn't wait for just a day or a week or a month or a year, but he waited for many years for this particular job to even come to fruition. He waited probably 15 to 20 years before he would even be king over a small portion of Israel. And then another additional 7 years to be king over all of Israel. But here is what we can learn from David. Here is what David did while he was waiting. He just kept walking. He just kept doing what he normally did. And while he walked, he just believed God was doing something. And I realized that's the difference between how we as Christians handle waiting versus how a non-Christian handles waiting. Because here's what we learn. During the waiting, and I mean during the waiting, and we learn this with David, King David wasn't exempt from waiting. All the people in the Bible weren't exempt from waiting. It's just something, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, that is a part of life. But here's what we learn about what God was doing while David was waiting. And here's one: God was growing David's faith. David had to continually believe that God had promised this and he would do it, but there was something that was coming down the pike. And David needed to really remember that and be reminded of that. But in order for that to happen, his faith had to grow big enough to know God so well that he just trusted that God knew the right timing. Here's another one. God was putting David in situations where he had no choice but to trust him to take care of him and to provide for him. David was on the run for his life with just this anointing that he was going to be king, but he didn't know Saul was trying to kill him for years and years and years. And David had to just learn how to trust God through the really bad times. And then here's another one. God was showing David that what he was stressed and worried about might be what has been distracting him from a relationship with him. And I thought that with the coronavirus. And I thought, you know what? Sometimes with this, what I think this virus has done is made people stop and think and say, you know what is my life really all about? I'm so busy running and doing things, but maybe I've forgotten God along the way. And so sometimes I think waiting is good. It brings those things to the forefront. And that's why I think we can wait well. Because God had a purpose for David. And God has a purpose for you if you're a follower of Christ. And David's end game, God's end game for David was that David would become king. But there was a reason for that. David was to become king so that God would be made known. And the same, whatever we're waiting for, it's not for ourselves, it's not for our popularity, it's not for any of those things. It's so that we can make a really awesome God known to other people. But the thing is that takes a lot of time. But for a non-Christian, what I realized is that during this time, there's not a lot of purpose. They don't really know what. They're waiting to get back to work. For what? So that they can go to their jobs and they can make money. For what? Like there's just nothing purposeful or important about that except just waiting until they die. But as followers of Christ, we're waiting, but we're just knowing God's a part of it. We're waiting for God to give us the peace to show up in our life. There's just a really big difference between the two. Psalm 27:14 says this, "Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." And see, for David, I think that's what he learned. And when it comes to waiting, here's what we need to do. We need to do what David did. He just kept doing what he normally did. He kept living like he normally lived. And I love that. It's like we're just waiting and we're constantly worried what's going to happen and I'm just waiting. Stop. Just relax. Just wake up and do your normal day because that's exactly what David did. He woke up, he went and tended the sheep, and he did exactly the same thing every single day. And he was waiting for God to make a move. He was waiting for God to change his circumstances, for God to open a door, for all the pieces to be in place. And then when God was ready and a door was opened, then David walked through it. And see, what we see with David is he didn't run around kicking doors down, telling people, I'm going to be king. None of that. He never yelled at God like, you're just taking too long to make me king. But instead, he did what we all hate to do, which is this. Wait. I hate to wait. I found these really good cookies at McDonald's, chocolate chip cookies at McDonald's. First time I ever ordered them, it was so cool. They handed them to me and they must have just made them. And they were nice and soft and they were like the yummiest cookies ever. So the second time I went back to McDonald's, I'm like, hi, I need 2 chocolate chip cookies. But they came out like cold and not like I had before. So I started learning, like when I go to McDonald's, I'm like, 2 cookies, but can you make them warm? But what happens is I get up to the place, I pay for my cookies, and they say, I'm sorry, you'll have to pull up there because it's going to take time for us to get them warm for you. And I'm like, really? It's waiting. I don't have time. Like it takes time to wait for a stupid chocolate chip cookie. But that's just life. Like we waited for years up and down to sell our business. We waited for our house to sell with up and down, up and down. We have like a business right now, we're just waiting for it to take off. Most of us wait for kids to be born. And then we wait desperately for them to go to school all day. I thought this was funny. One lady wrote and she said her boys came to her right when school was out in May. And they were like, Mom, when do we go back to school? And you know how it is when they first get home. She's like, Not sure. End of August, someday, maybe, not sure. In August, the boys come to her. Mom, when do we go back to school? Her answer is exactly 21 days, 3 hours, and 6 minutes. Because that's what waiting, like we're just waiting for something. For most of us, we're waiting for our kids to grow up. Maybe for them to get married. Maybe for us to get married, for us to get a perfect job. But what we see is this, all of life is really just a waiting game. And the options for us is we can wait well or we can wait poorly. And I was thinking about this with a pregnancy. Pregnancies are like a waiting game. We have rabbits. And so one day I was looking out at the rabbits and I was thinking, how long does it take a mommy rabbit to have babies? 28 days. I was like, 28 days? Why does it take us 9 months? And I think it's because God takes 9 months to prepare us for what's about ready to happen. And so during that time, we prepare by reading books and we prepare for the birth and we paint the room. We stock up diapers, have baby showers. Because waiting is a time of preparation. And the same goes for whatever you and I are waiting for. We might not be ready for what God wants us to have. And see, King David, at 12, he was nowhere ready to be king. And so God uses our waiting time to prepare us. I was just telling this to Cheyenne this morning. I said, Cheyenne, you've grown so much in your faith. Like, it's the cutest thing to hear her talk. But I was like, oh my gosh, if you had married the person that you thought you wanted to marry 5 years ago, like, that would have been a disaster. But God has always stopped her from marrying who she wasn't supposed to marry, because I'm like, he's really preparing you and really preparing your husband. So that's a good thing. You're just waiting, but while you're waiting, God's preparing you. So while David was waiting, God was doing some amazing things behind the scene to prepare him for this. And look how it all started. This is how awesome God is. 1 Samuel 16:14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had left King Saul, and the Lord sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear because Saul ended up being a bad king. And so someone said, let us find a good musician to play the harp. Whenever the tormenting spirit troubles you, he will play soothing music and you will soon be well again. And then one of the servants, this is amazing, said to Saul, well, wait a minute, one of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior, a man of war, he's good judgment, he's a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. And then in verse 19, so Saul sent messengers to Jesse to send me your son. Who? David, the shepherd. Out of all the people in all of Israel at that time, the one person that can play the harp, that comes to King Saul to get to know kind of maybe the ins and outs of the palace, is little David. And it's interesting that out of all the hobbies, David's out in his sheep. He's just kind of, what am I going to do with my life? So he learned how to play the harp. Like, see, God just uses normal, everyday things. What do you like to do? David liked to play the harp. David liked to slingshot. Like, whatever you use that's just normal, God wants to use that to catapult you to the next place. It's funny, God uses things like just a chance meeting, a phone call, a job offer. Our son got a job offer, or has the job that he's in right now because one of his friends heard about this job and was like, oh, you know what? I think Sean might be good at that. And that's how he got his job. It's just normal, everyday activity. See, I think that normal, everyday life is how God moves us to the next place. It's just like this. This is when David was catapulted to the next level. The Israelites were at war with the dreaded Philistines. David's brother were fighting for King Saul. And something just ordinary happened. David's dad says, hey, go take some food to your brothers. They're on the front lines of the battle. So David's like, sure, Dad, whatever, no problem. Nothing unusual, just a normal day. It wasn't even a big deal. But that day would change the course of David's life forever. And suddenly the waiting would move to a whole new level. See, here's what you need to know. In just one day, everything can change. You may have been waiting 10 years for something, and just like David's, one day it could change. So he shows up, he gives his brother some food, he sees this giant of a man. He's a pagan Philistine. And he's over there mocking God. He's mocking the God of Israel, and he's making the God of Israel out to be powerless, and he's laughing at him. Of course, we know this man is Goliath. But David, little David, while he was out shepherding his sheep, he was getting to know God. And he'd seen how powerful God was by protecting his sheep from bears and wolves or whatever was out there. Here's what David knew. David knew God, and when you know God, you know he can do anything. And so David takes the challenge. Little David picks up a few stones, kills Goliath. And from then on, David was on his way to be king. But it still didn't happen overnight. David still had a lot of, here's our word, waiting. David had a lot of waiting to do. Because it would take 20 years or so, and that's a long time to wait for something. And even during that time, it was tough. He was on the run for his life, but there's a lesson in that for us. Waiting doesn't mean just sitting around twiddling our thumbs. Waiting doesn't mean just sit around and do nothing. Waiting means, possibly like David, going through some really difficult days. See, we struggled financially when we hadn't sold our business. We struggled financially before we sold our house. But while we were waiting, we just didn't sit home and do nothing. We moved forward. But while we wait, we need to let God train us, to let God grow us up spiritually, to let God show us he can provide for us. And we need to do what David did, which was just to wait well. And how we do that is this: relax. Trust God will open the door at the right time. Stay busy. Keep doing what you normally do. Because for David, you know what he did? He just went to the field every day. And he watched his sheep, and he fed his sheep, and he wrote songs, and he wrote worship songs that you can read in Psalms. He spent his days getting to know God, and that's why God called this little boy a man after his own heart. And when God was ready to move David to the next place, David was ready. And that's how you and I can wait well. Because we know we have a powerful God that's guiding us through normal, everyday events to move us to the place that he's trying to get us to. And the difference is between a Christian waiting and a non-Christian waiting is that you and I believe that we have a guiding hand by the God of this whole universe who has a purpose and a plan for us and knows exactly when that door is going to be opened for us to walk through it. And in the meantime, we just wait well. That's our encouraging truth today. So we'll see you next week.